The Rise of Dictators, Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler. So what helped them rise? The treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, helped them rise to power, because what it's going to do is throw a lot of European countries into a depression following World War I. This created an anti-democratic sentiment throughout these countries, because it looks like that democracy cannot work in these countries. Furthermore, what the U.S. does with not joining the League of Nations and our return to normalcy at the end of World War I, where we just want to let the good times roll and not be involved in world politics, we go back to our original foreign policy of unilateralism and not internationalism. We go back to our original foreign policy. So what happens is we're one of the world's leading democratic nations, and we do not help these nations. We don't help them become stable democratic states. We just basically say there's a book on it, go read it, and we drop out of the world for the most part. When I say that, remember, unilateralism is a one-sided foreign policy. So if it's good for us, that will do it. So we're not really looking at helping other nations. So Benito Mussolini, he's a former schoolmaster, journalist. He fought in World War I, and he founds the fascist party in Italy. So what characterizes fascism? Fascism is a kind of aggressive nationalism. It emphasizes nation over the idea of the individual. It argued that individualism created a weak government, believed that a nation becomes great by expanding territory and building a military. They're anti-communist. Italians were tired of strikes and riots throughout their nation, so government takes over and controls everything. Basically, he compartmentalized government. Is called the corporate state, and he had, I believe it was, everything in society could fit into one of 7 categories. He also calls for women to win the battle of childbirth, or the war of childbirth, and that is, he encouraged big families. He encouraged women to be pregnant and to have 10 to 14 kids, simply because half of them, the majority of them, could be men, and boys will become good soldiers, help him build his military. So how did he appeal to the people? Europeans feared communism was trying to bring down their governments throughout Europe. Fascism stood for the protection of private property and middle-class jobs, also Social Security. They stressed national honor and pride and prestige. The next guy, Joseph Stalin. Vladimir Lenin set up a power base that helped Stalin take control. The Communist Party created a one-party rule, suppressed individual liberties, punished people who spoke out. Lenin dies in 1924, and there becomes a 3-year power struggle in the Soviet Union as to who's going to become the leader. Stalin would eventually win this in 1927. Lenin's right-hand man, the guy who really was responsible for the revolution, and he was a revolutionary ahead of his time, Leon Trotsky, actually is Stalin's opponent. And just to kind of tell you how Stalin was, Stalin had him hunted down for 13 years. Trotsky was forced to travel the world, and Trotsky ends up being assassinated in Mexico City in 1940, so by Stalin's agents. How did Stalin appear to the people? He industrialized the country. So he brought them into the 20th century. He ruled by fear, and he's going to kill, it says here, he kills 8 to 10 million peasants who attempted to revolt against him. He's on record as killing over 25 million of his own people. He kills 2/3 of his military leadership in 1936 through 1938 because he thought they were going to take power from him. So Adolf Hitler, he's an anti-communist, admired Mussolini. He also fought in World War One. He believed he had a divine power because he lived through World War One. He's the only one in his regiment to live. He once watched 60 men around him die, get shot and killed, and he lived. So he thought he had a special purpose in life. He joins the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. He's nationalistic, anti-communist. He attempted to take over Munich and seize Berlin. It failed in 1925, and he's imprisoned. When he's in prison, he dictates his beliefs, and he has a 2-volume book. One was written while he was in jail in 1925, Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. The second volume come out in 1927. Basically, it outlines everything he did as a leader. So if the final solution, the Holocaust, was a surprise to a lot of people, if you read the book, it wasn't. He actually said he was going to do this in 1925 and 1927. So people who knew about Hitler, people who read him, should, they knew this was everything he did as a leader was kind of like, oh, yeah, it's in the book. So how did he appeal to the people? Germans were desperate for economic improvement. They were the poorest country in Europe. They were basically, or they were one of the poorest countries in Europe. They were basically being bullied by Britain and France. They pushed for expansion into Poland after Hitler comes to power. Hitler claimed that Germans, blonde-haired, blue eyes, were the master race. And he blames all of the Germans' problems on the Jewish people. This was a racist or anti-Semitic group he had joined after, I believe it was shortly after World War One, where they were very discriminatory toward Jews and blamed them for everything. And he carried through with this. I'd like to point out also he had a lot of American support. Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company donated over $3 million to Hitler's cause throughout the 30s. And we had a lot of businessmen over here that really supported Hitler. So how does he gain power? He supported the election of the Nazi Party candidates to the German parliament, the Reichstag. The German president appointed Hitler as prime minister. That would be von Hindenburg. And he was like the vice president. And Hitler held elections, gave Nazis more power. When von Hindenburg dies in 1933, he basically takes power. He's never elected president or never elected leader of Germany, but he takes the power. So, in Japan, as you see, too many imports and too few exports. So, low economic growth in Japan, unemployment was high. Japanese military leaders blamed the corrupt politicians. The military leaders invade Manchuria in 1931 for their resources without government permission. The government actually told them not to do this. So this was a big success, and actually they bombed their own trains. The Japanese Air Force in Manchuria, the Japanese Air Force flew over Manchuria and bombed Japanese trains, bringing goods to Japan. I mean, of course, they have to be shipped to Japan, but they bombed their own train line. And they blamed it on the Chinese and said the Chinese are the ones who did this, so that's what gave them the green light to invade Manchuria. This ends up being very popular with the Japanese public. The military leaders will then assassinate the Japanese prime minister and take over. So American isolationism. As you see, why did most Americans not want to get involved in another war in Europe? Well, I mean, here's the reason. European debtor nations were not paying back the debt from American loans from World War One, so they don't want to fight another war. We don't want to fight another war because they're already in debt to us, and we don't want to have to go any farther in debt. The Nye Commission, basically, it documented huge profits that arms factories made during World War One, and in fact, they encouraged the war to go on so they could make more money. This leads to the Neutrality Acts of 1935, made it illegal for Americans to sell arms to any foreign country at war. Our current president in 1935 was FDR. He did not like these acts. He didn't like any of these neutrality acts because he saw Hitler for what he was, and he saw Japan for what they were. And he knew we would probably have to get involved with these guys. The Neutrality Acts of 1937 continues the ban, but it also required warring countries to buy non-military supplies by cash and carry only. The purpose of this was to prevent attacks on neutral American trade ships. But as I said, our president did not agree with these things, and he did what he could to get around these acts and prepare us for war. The Axis powers, as you see, required Germany and Japan to exchange information about communist groups, and these are your three Axis powers leading into World War II. So FDR's position, he supported internationalism, not isolationism or unilateralism. Internationalism is the idea that trade between countries creates prosperity. He will sell arms to China to defend itself. Neither China nor Japan had formally declared war on each other, but we start sending support to some of these nations behind the American public's back and behind Congress's back. That's all.